The story will open with a chilling, cinematic line capturing the betrayal, the son handing over his father's home, followed by a dark emotional hook that sets the tone of power, humiliation, and quiet vengeance. A seamless emotional call to action will follow, something haunting and personal like. If you've ever been underestimated by the people you love most, stay till the end. There's a particular kind of silence that only comes from disappointment, not the loud, angry kind, but the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there. The kind that turns a home into a hollow stage, where love has long since taken its final bow. That silence had been living with Robert for years. His villa, once filled with laughter, music, and the soft hum of ordinary joy, had turned into a showroom for someone else's ego. The portraits on the walls weren't a family anymore. They were a curated perfection, carefully chosen to please his daughter-in-law's visiting friends. And his son, Bradley, the boy he had raised with every ounce of patience and love a man could give, was slowly becoming unrecognizable. It started small. A new tone in Bradley's voice. A subtle distance in the way he spoke to his father. Once, they'd been inseparable. Robert had taught him everything. How to hammer nails straight. How to drive a stick shift. How to stay honest when the world tried to buy his soul. But now? Now Bradley looked at him like he was a burden, an outdated photograph fading at the edge of a new frame. Robert had built everything from nothing. The villa, the company, the reputation, all carved from sweat and sleepless years. Yet he never wore his success like armor. He preferred the quiet life, far from the spotlight. His wife had passed away years ago, and with her went the warmth of home. Bradley was all he had left. His legacy, his blood, his one living thread to a life that once meant something. When Bradley met Victoria, Robert wanted to be happy for him. She was polished, elegant, charming, everything Bradley thought would complete him. Her family came from money, old money, the kind that wore its arrogance like cologne. They smiled at Robert during dinners, but their eyes always said the same thing. You're not one of us. At first, Robert ignored it. He was used to condescension. He'd spent a lifetime proving men like that wrong. But this was different. This was family. Victoria's father, in particular, had a way of speaking that sliced through pride like glass. He'd compliment Robert's villa, then smirk as if amused by how quaint it was. He called it rustic luxury, the kind of phrase rich men use when they want to sound generous while being cool. Robert always smiled, always remained polite, because he believed that dignity didn't need to raise its voice. But behind closed doors, he saw how their presence changed his son. Bradley began spending less time at home and more time at Victoria's family estate. He came back wearing new suits, new mannerisms, phrases that didn't sound like him. He spoke about rebranding the family image, as if their lives were a product to sell. Robert knew what was happening. He'd seen men lose themselves before, trading authenticity for acceptance. But it hurt differently when the man doing it carried your last name. One evening, Robert hosted dinner at the villa, a tradition he'd kept since his wife's passing. It was supposed to be simple, a quiet meal, family, laughter. But with Victoria's family there, it felt like performance. The table gleamed beneath the chandelier. Crystal glasses caught the light, silver cutlery arranged with military precision. Victoria sat across from Robert, her posture perfect, her smile rehearsed. Her parents flanked her like royalty inspecting the peasantry. So, her father began, slicing his steak. Bradley tells us his property's worth nearly $6 million. Not bad for how did you put it, Robert? A modest businessman? Robert smiled faintly. Something like that. Victoria's mother gave a soft, patronizing laugh. You must be very proud. Such a lovely home. Though I suppose keeping it maintained at your age must be challenging. Robert took a sip of his wine. I manage. Of course, she said, until the next generation steps in. Bradley shifted uncomfortably beside her, but said nothing. Victoria's father leaned forward, eyes glinting. Tell me, Robert, have you ever considered transferring ownership early? You know, let the young ones handle things. Modernize, expand, perhaps even leverage the property. Robert met his gaze. This house isn't a business venture. It's a home. The man chuckled. Everything's an investment, my friend. Even sentiment. The table laughed politely. Everyone except Robert. He looked at his son then, hoping for something. A glance, a word, a sign that Bradley still stood by him. But Bradley only looked away. And in that moment, something inside Robert cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough for him to feel it. It was the first fracture, the first quiet betrayal. Later that night, when the guests had left and the laughter had died, Robert sat alone in the study. The air smelled of old wood and memories. He could hear faint echoes of his wife's laughter, the way she used to hum while reading near the fireplace. He missed her most on nights like this, when silence hurt more than words ever could. Bradley came in, his tie loosened, his eyes avoiding his father's. "Dad, listen," about what they said. Robert cut him off. "You don't need to explain. They didn't mean any harm. I know exactly what they meant." Bradley sighed. "You're taking it too personally. They are just different." "They are not different," Robert said quietly. "They are arrogant, and you're starting to sound like them." Bradley frowned. "You don't understand. Dad, the world isn't what it was when you built all this. People see success differently now. It's about image, influence, partnerships. And respect," Robert interrupted. "Don't forget that word." Bradley's face hardened. "You think I don't respect you? I think you're forgetting where you came from." The silence that followed was sharper than any argument. Bradley turned and left without another word. When the door shut, Robert stared at it for a long time, his reflection faintly visible in the glass cabinet across the room. He didn't recognize the man looking back at him, not because of age, but because of loss. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Bradley's visits grew shorter, his tone colder. Victoria's influence deepened like ink spreading across parchment. Then one morning, the housekeeper brought in an envelope addressed to Robert. Legal stationery, crisp and heavy. He opened it slowly, his eyes scanning the words until they stopped on one sentence that drained the blood from his face. "Transfer of ownership, Miller Estate, hereby reassigned to Mr. and Mrs. Bradley Miller, effective immediately." His hands trembled. He read it again. And again. His own son had signed away the villa, the home he had built with his bare hands, brick by brick, memory by memory, to impress his wife's family. When Bradley arrived later that evening, Robert was waiting. "Tell me this isn't true," Robert said, holding the document. Bradley's expression was unreadable. "It's just paperwork, Dad. A formality. You'll still live here." Robert's voice shook. "You handed over my house." "I didn't hand it over," Bradley said defensively. "It's still in the family. We're just restructuring. Victoria's father thinks." "I don't care what he thinks." Robert's voice thundered, echoing off the marble walls. "This was your mother's home, my life's work, and you gave it away like a wedding gift." Bradley's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't understand. This is about progress, not sentiment." Robert stared at him, his heart breaking and hardening all at once. "No," he said, "this is about pride, and you've traded your soul for theirs." Bradley's face flushed with anger. "You've always looked down on me. Maybe you're just afraid that I'm finally doing better than you ever did." For a moment, Robert said nothing. Then he simply nodded. "If that's what you believe, son, then I'll let you have it." Bradley hesitated. "You're not fighting this." Robert smiled faintly, a tired, haunting smile. "Not tonight." When Bradley left, Robert sat in silence, the papers still in his hands. His pulse was steady, his breathing calm. Because beneath the heartbreak, beneath the betrayal, something else had begun to stir. Something old and powerful. He'd been quiet his whole life. Patient, kind. But kindness, when pushed too far, becomes something else entirely. And in that silence, Robert made a promise to himself. They had taken his house, but they were about to learn what it truly meant to take something from a man who built his life from ashes. Morning sunlight spilled across the marble floors of the villa, but to Robert, it felt colder than ever before. The walls at once echoed his wife's laughter, and his son's footsteps now felt foreign, like they belonged to someone else. Because they did. He moved slowly through the house, touching the edges of furniture, framed photographs, the wooden banister he'd carved with his own hands decades ago. Every surface whispered memory. Every shadow carried the ghost of what he'd built. And now, it was no longer his. Bradley's signature, his son's signature, had rewritten history. The Miller estate, the home that had been Robert's pride, his sanctuary, was now joint property under Bradley and Victoria's name. Robert could afford it legally. He could have torn the whole arrangement apart with a single phone call. But he didn't, because he understood something his son didn't, that some debts can't be settled in court. Some debts demand silence, and silence, when chosen carefully, can become the sharpest weapon of all. The first few weeks after the transfer felt like living in a museum of betrayal. Victoria moved in with her polished smiles and designer boxes, redecorating rooms that didn't need fixing. The old portraits of Robert and his late wife were removed, temporarily, she'd said, and replaced with art that looked like it belonged in a hotel lobby. She called it modernizing. Robert called it erasure. Her family visited often, their laughter echoing through the halls as if the place were theirs. Her father, smug as ever, clapped Bradley on the back one evening during dinner. "You've done well, son. You're finally learning how to think big." Robert sat at the far end of the table, silent, his fork untouched. He watched his son beam with pride, not for earning something, but for taking it, for stealing the sweat of another man's lifetime and calling it strategy. Victoria smiled at him across the table, the kind of smile that hides cruelty behind etiquette. "You must be happy, Robert. Bradley's really stepping up, don't you think?" Robert looked at her, truly looked, and saw the kind of hunger that devours everything it touches. "I suppose is learning from the best," he said softly. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes did. Later that night, Robert sat in his study, the only room they hadn't dared to change. He kept the lights low, the air heavy with memory. On the desk lay an old photograph, Bradley as a child, sitting on Robert's shoulders, both of them smiling under a half-built roof. Back then, the villa had been nothing more than cement and dust. Robert had built it with his own hands, stone by stone, sometimes sleeping in the unfinished rooms just to keep watch over it. It wasn't just a house. It was a proof of everything he'd survived: poverty, struggle, the loss of his parents, and later, the love of his life. Now it had been traded away, like a business asset. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared into the amber liquid, the reflection of his tired eyes shimmering in it. That was when he decided he wouldn't take the house back. He'd take everything back, but not through rage. Rage was messy, predictable. He'd do it the way he'd done everything else in life, with patience, precision, and purpose. The next morning, Robert made breakfast for himself, something he hadn't done in years. Pancakes, coffee, just like the old days. He sat by the window, watching as Bradley and Victoria left the house, dressed to impress, their voices light and shallow. He waited until the sound of their car disappeared. Then he stood, grabbed his keys, and left. Downtown, the city buzzed with the rhythm of business and ambition. Robert hadn't been to his old office in years. Officially, he'd retired, quietly stepping back to let the younger generation lead. But what no one knew, not even his son, was that Robert never really retired. He had simply changed his position. He still owned 49% of the company, enough to stay invisible, enough to stay dangerous. When he stepped into the building that bore his last name, Miller Holdings, the receptionist still stood a little straighter. His name still carried weight. In his private office, untouched for years, everything was exactly as he'd left it. The view stretched across the city, his city glittering beneath the morning sun. His assistant, a woman named Clara who'd been with him for decades, entered quietly. "Sir," she said, surprised but composed. "I didn't know you'd be coming in today." Robert smiled faintly. "Neither did I." She hesitated. "Is it about your son?" Robert looked out the window. "No," he said. "It's about his education." Over the next few weeks, Robert began moving quietly. He attended meetings no one expected him to. He reviewed files long ignored. He watched, listened, and learned what Bradley had been doing since taking over operations with Victoria's family advisors. He found waste, corruption, decisions made out of vanity instead of vision. Bradley wasn't building an empire. He was burning one, slowly, for the applause of people who didn't care about him. One night, Clara walked into his office holding a folder. "You need to see this," she said. Inside were purchase orders and fund transfers. Large sums moved from the company's development fund to shell corporations connected to Victoria's family. Robert closed the folder, his jaw tightening. "How long?" he asked. 6 months, maybe longer. He exhaled slowly, and no one said a word. "Everyone assumed you approved it," she said quietly. "Bradley said it was your idea." Robert sat back, staring into the dark. The betrayal wasn't just personal anymore. It was systemic. His name, his life's work, were being used to fund greed. But instead of anger, he felt something else. Calm. The kind of calm that comes right before a storm you've been waiting your whole life to unleash. The storm didn't come overnight. It brewed in silence. The kind that makes you think nothing's happening until lightning strikes right above your head. Robert knew better than to rush it. Revenge, like construction, required a blueprint. You don't destroy an empire. You reclaim it one brick at a time. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for a house. He was fighting for his name. He began every morning before sunrise. The villa was quiet then, the air thick with fog and dew. He'd sit in the garden with a notebook, the same one he'd once used to draft his first company plan 35 years ago. Back then, it was filled with dreams. Now, it held strategies, precise, surgical steps toward a reckoning. He wasn't reckless. He didn't need to be. He still owned the one thing his son had never owned, control. At Miller Holdings, the board was uneasy. Bradley had spent months charming them with false promises and corporate jargon. But charm doesn't balance ledgers. When Robert walked into the conference room unannounced one morning, conversation stopped mid-sentence. The board chairman, an old colleague named Harris, stood. "Robert," he said, "surprise, we thought you'd step down." "I did," Robert said, setting his briefcase on the table. "But I never stepped away." He opened the case and spread the papers across the mahogany surface. Contracts, financial reports, legal transfers. "Your current CEO," he said calmly, "has been funding his in-laws' ventures with company assets. That's not partnership, that's theft." The room fell into stunned silence. One of the younger directors adjusted his glasses nervously. "If this is true." "It's not just true," Robert interrupted, his voice steady but cutting. "It's documented." He turned to Clara, who had followed him in with a second folder. She placed it beside his. "These," he continued, "are the accounts. Each transfer, each falsified approval, each connection traced directly to Victoria's family." Gasps rippled through the room. Harris looked pale. "Robert, this could ruin him." Robert's expression didn't change. He's already ruined himself. "I'm just making sure the mess doesn't stain the rest of us." By the end of that week, the internal audit was underway. Quiet, confidential, but news travels faster than caution. Bradley began to sense something was wrong when investors stopped returning his calls. He'd come home agitated, pacing the halls, snapping at Victoria. "Someone sabotaging me," he'd say, running his hands through his hair. "They are turning the board against me." Victoria, still convinced of a family's invincibility, would just smile. "You're overreacting. My father has connections. We'll fix it." But Robert, sitting in his study, pretending to read, could hear the panic creeping into his son's voice through the walls. It was a sound that once would have broken his heart. Now, it only confirmed that justice was waking up. One evening, Clara called him. "The audit's complete," she said quietly. "It's worse than we thought." "How bad?" "Over $7 million diverted to shell companies, all tied to Victoria's father." Robert exhaled slowly. "And the evidence?" "Undeniable. The auditors are ready to present." "Then we wait," he said. "Timing matters more than truth." He hung up and stared out the window at the dark garden beyond. It was raining, soft at first, then harder until the sound filled the room like applause. He smiled faintly. "She'd like this," he whispered to the night, imagining his late wife's voice in the rhythm of the rain. A week later came the gala. Victoria had planned it, a lavish charity event in their name, hosted at the villa. She said it would redefine the Miller image. The irony wasn't lost on Robert. The guest list glittered with power. Politicians, executives, socialites, people who only smiled when cameras were on. The chandeliers dripped with crystal light. Champagne flowed freely, and a string quartet played something beautiful and cold. Bradley moved through the crowd like a prince on borrowed land, shaking hands, laughing too loudly. Victoria glided beside him in silver silk, the perfect hostess. Robert stood near the back, dressed in a simple black suit, unnoticed but watching everything. He didn't mind being invisible. Invisibility was where truth lived. As the evening unfolded, whispers began to ripple through the room, subtle at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. Guests leaned toward one another, murmuring. Phones buzzed. Eyes darted toward Bradley. Robert knew why. The audit results had leaked. Not through accident, through design. Victoria's father was the first to realize. His face went pale, then red. He excused himself from a group of investors and pulled Bradley aside. "What did you do?" he hissed. "They know. The board knows. This whole thing, it's over." Bradley blinked, confused, terrified. "What are you talking about?" "7 million, you idiot!" His father-in-law spat under his breath. "Your father's company traced it all back to me." Bradley's face drained of color. "My father wouldn't." But then he saw him, Robert, standing at the edge of the ballroom, calm, still, with a glass of water in his hand and a gaze that could cut through marble. Bradley's voice faltered. "He wouldn't do this to me." His father-in-law's eyes narrowed. "He already has." The rest unfolded like a quiet play. The whispers turned into stays. The polite smile fractured. Guests began to leave early. Within an hour, Victoria's father had stormed out, followed by her mother's humiliated silence. Victoria, desperate to salvage dignity, tried to hold the room together with laughter. "Everyone's overreacting," she said. "It's just a misunderstanding." But even her voice trembled. Bradley stood motionless in the center of it all, his perfect image collapsing in real time. And then Robert stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gloat. He simply said, "The Miller name was built on integrity. It survived wars, debt, and loss. But it won't survive corruption." The room froze. Bradley turned to him, eyes wide. "Dad, please, don't do this here." Robert looked at him. His only son, the man who'd once been his greatest pride and was now his deepest disappointment. "You already did." Then he turned to the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, this event was meant to honor charity. So tonight, let's make that true. Every dollar raised here will go directly to the Miller Foundation, in my wife's name, to rebuild what greed tried to destroy." The applause started small, hesitant, then grew. It wasn't for Bradley or Victoria. It was for him, the man they'd underestimated. Bradley stood frozen as guests congratulated Robert, ignoring him completely. The prince had been dethroned, quietly and completely. When the last guest left, and only echoes remained, Robert walked through the empty ballroom. Bradley approached him, his face pale, his voice hoarse. "You humiliated me." "No," Robert said softly. "You did that when you forgot who you were." Bradley's hand shook. "You've ruined me." Robert turned to him. "No, son, I freed you. The man you were pretending to be was killing you." Victoria appeared then, mascara streaked, anger burning through her calm. "You vindictive old man," she spat. "You'll regret this." Robert smiled, the kind of smile that ends arguments. "No, you will." He walked past them both, pausing at the doorway. "The villa," he said quietly, "was never yours. I built it. You just lived in it. You can stay until morning." Then he left, the sound of his footsteps echoing like the closing of a chapter. That night, the storm finally broke, rain hammering the roof as if washing the house clean. Robert stood in his old office, looking out at the lightning splitting the sky. For the first time in years, he didn't feel small. He wasn't just a father anymore. He was the architect of justice. And in that reflection, he saw not vengeance, but balance, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally remembered who he was. The following morning, sunlight crept across the villa like forgiveness arriving too late. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered, A trail of shattered glass from the terrace, overturned chairs from the gala, the faint scent of rain mixing with perfume and regret. Robert stood by the window, coffee in hand, watching as the dawn touched everything his son once claimed to own. The marble floors gleamed again, the rose garden glistened with dew. It looked peaceful, but peace, Robert knew, was often the mask ruin wore before showing its face. Downstairs, voices broke the stillness. Victoria's tone was sharp, clipped. Bradley's was low, defeated. Robert didn't need to listen closely to know what they were saying. He'd heard that kind of conversation before, between desperate people who'd built their world on vanity and now stood in its ruins. When he finally descended the staircase, they were waiting for him in the living room. Victoria, her elegance unraveling, still clung to her composure like it might save her. Bradley looked smaller somehow, not in stature, but in spirit. The confident son who once strutted through these halls was gone. In his place stood a man cornered by the consequences of his own reflection. "Dad," Bradley began, his voice unsteady, "we need to talk." Robert sipped his coffee. "Do we?" Victoria stepped in. "What you did last night was cruel. Publicly humiliating your son, our family. You ruined his career. And for what? To make yourself feel powerful." Robert regarded her for a long moment. "You mistake justice for cruelty." Bradley ran a hand through his hair. "Dad, please. I know I made mistakes, but—" Robert cut him off quietly. "Mistakes are leaving the lights on. What you did was deliberate." Victoria scoffed. "You act like some moral saint, but all you've done is hurt people. You embarrassed us in front of everyone we know." "Then perhaps," Robert said, "you should meet better people." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Bradley stepped closer, his expression pleading now. "I can fix this. Just give me time." "The investors—" "They are gone," Robert interrupted. "The company's board voted you out this morning. Your accounts are frozen pending investigation." Bradley blinked. "What?" "I told them to move fast," Robert said, setting down his cup. "You taught me how urgency motivates people." "You can't do that." Bradley's voice cracked, desperation bleeding through. Robert's eyes softened, but only slightly. "You already did. The moment you used my name to fund corruption, you gave me no choice." Victoria turned sharply to Bradley. "You said this was handled." He snapped. "You said your father would cover it." "And you believed me," she shot back. "You can't even manage your own inheritance without turning it into a circus." Their words tumbled over each other, sharp and venomous. Robert stood between them, silent, watching the empire of arrogance collapse from within. When Victoria finally stormed out, heels clacking like gunfire against marble, Robert turned back to his son. "I didn't want this," he said quietly, "but you left me no other way to reach you." Bradley's voice dropped to a whisper. "You've taken everything from me." Robert shook his head. "No, Bradley. I've taken nothing. I'm just giving back what you threw away." He paused, his voice growing softer, almost sorrowful. "You think I wanted to expose you? You think I take joy in watching my own son fall? I wanted to teach you what real legacy is. It isn't wealth. It's worth." Bradley's eyes filled, the anger replaced by something fragile. "Then what am I supposed to do now?" Robert stepped closer, his tone steady but not unkind. "Start over. Without lies. Without greed. You were born with my name. Now learn to deserve it." He handed him an envelope, thick, sealed with a Miller insignia. Bradley hesitated before opening it. Inside was a check, modest by their standards, but enough to rebuild something honest. "What's this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "A test," Robert said, "to see if you can build without taking from others. If you fail, it's over. But if you succeed, you'll never need me again." Bradley's fingers clenched around the check. "And if I walk away?" Robert smiled faintly. "Then at least you'll finally be doing it for the right reason." After his son left, the house grew quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one felt earned. Robert walked through the halls slowly, taking in the scars of the previous night. The cracked vase, the half-empty glasses, the abandoned shoes near the door. It was all temporary. The chaos would fade. The truth would stay. He made his way to his wife's old garden, the earth still damp from rain. He knelt beside her favorite roses, the ones she planted when the villa was first built. Their petals were open, vibrant red against the morning light. "I did it, Margaret," he murmured. "I finally stopped saving him." The wind stirred gently, as if answering. In the weeks that followed, word spread quietly through their world. The Miller scandal became a cautionary tale, whispered about in boardrooms, dissected at dinner parties. But what most people remembered wasn't the fall of Bradley Miller. It was the rise of Robert, the man they dismissed as an aging relic who suddenly reminded everyone what power really looked like. He never gloated, never sought credit. Instead, he focused on rebuilding the Miller Foundation, the charitable branch he and his wife had started years ago. He poured his wealth into hospitals, schools, and shelters. Every new project bore her name, not his. And when people asked him why, he'd simply reply, "Because he believed legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's what we give while we're still here." Months passed before he saw Bradley again. It was at a small charity event in a downtown community center, far from the chandeliers and champagne of that old world. Robert had gone quietly, as he often did, to observe. He didn't expect to see his son there. Bradley stood at the volunteer table, helping distribute supplies. No suits, no photographers, just a plain shirt and tired hands. He looked older, humbler. Their eyes met across the room. For a long moment, neither moved. Then Bradley approached, hesitating like a child unsure if he was welcome. "Dad," he said softly. "Bradley." "I've been working here," he said, gesturing to the volunteers. "It's not much, but it feels real." Robert nodded. "It always does when it comes from your own hands." Bradley looked down. "I'm sorry." Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know." They stood there in silence, the hum of laughter and conversation filling the space between them. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was the beginning of something close. When Robert left that evening, he didn't look back at the city skyline. He didn't need to. The storm had passed, and the ground beneath him finally felt steady again. At home, he poured himself a glass of wine and sat in his study. The clock ticked softly, steady as a heartbeat. On his desk sat a single photograph. His wife, smiling beside the villa when it was first finished, sunlight catching in her hair. He touched the frame gently. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "I taught him what a man should be." And for the first time in years, he let the silence wrap around him, not as punishment, but as peace. The seasons turned quietly after that. The once gilded villa stood half empty, its walls no longer echoing with arrogance or hollow laughter. Robert had reclaimed it not through law, but through dignity, and in doing so, he'd stripped it of every false thing it had once represented. The grand chandeliers still hung from the ceiling, the garden still bloomed, but the air had changed. It no longer carried the scent of greed. It smelled of something cleaner, solitude, perhaps, or redemption. He had spent a lifetime building empires, surviving wars of finance and family, but this was his final construction. Peace built on truth. He often spent his mornings walking through the villa grounds, hand behind his back, greeting the caretakers, pausing to prune the roses his wife once loved. They'd grown wild while chaos consumed the house, but now they thrived again, climbing the trellises with quiet persistence. Every now and then, Robert would find himself staring at the horizon, where the hills curved into the distance. That was where his son had gone, not far geographically, but far enough to learn humility. Bradley's life had shrunk to fit the truth, and in doing so, it had become something that finally belonged to him. It was on a Sunday afternoon when Bradley returned. No chauffeur, no designer suit, just a modest car and the uncertain steps of a man who no longer knew if he was welcome where he once reigned. Robert was sitting in the courtyard, reading, when the sound of tires on gravel made him look up. Bradley stood at the gate, his silhouette framed against the sunlight. For a long time, neither spoke. The air between them was thick, not with anger anymore, but with history. "Can I come in?" Bradley finally asked. Robert nodded once. "It's still your home, in a way." Bradley smiled faintly. "I'm not sure I've earned that." "Then maybe it's time you try." He entered quietly, his eyes scanning the familiar holes now stripped of Victoria's touch. No more gold embellishments, no cold art meant to impress. The house was simpler now, warmer. It looked alive again. They sat together in the study, the same place where years ago Robert had decided to start his silent revenge. This time, there were no documents, no plans. Just two men and the weight of what they'd both lost. "I've been working," Bradley began, his voice careful. "Small projects, community builds, helping with the foundation. It's not what I used to have." Robert interrupted softly. "No, it's more. Because this time, it's yours." Bradley's eyes flickered. Surprise, maybe even pride, hidden beneath humility. "I don't deserve forgiveness." Robert leaned back, studying him. "Forgiveness isn't something you deserve. It's something you grow into." There was a long silence. The sound of a clock filled the room, the same clock that had ticked through betrayal, through grief, through revenge. "I saw Victoria last week," Bradley said suddenly. "She's leaving the country with her family. They lost everything when the investigation ended." Robert's face remained calm, though his eyes softened. "People who build on lies always do." "She said you ruined her." Robert exhaled slowly, the faintest trace of a bitter smile on his lips. "I didn't ruin her. I simply stopped her from ruining us." Bradley nodded, silent, the weight of his father's words settling deep. Later that evening, they walked through the garden together. The sunset washed the sky in gold and blood, casting long shadows across the villa grounds. Robert stopped by the old stone bench, the one where his wife used to sit while planting her flower beds. He gestured for Bradley to sit beside him. "She loved this place more than anyone," Robert said softly. "Every corner, every wall. She saw beauty where I saw business. I built it, but she made it home." Bradley lowered his head. "I destroyed that." Robert looked at him. "No, you forgot it. There's a difference. Destruction is permanent. Forgetting, that can be undone." Bradley turned to him, eyes glassy. "Do you really believe that?" Robert smiled faintly. "You're here, aren't you?" The wind shifted then, carrying the scent of roses between them. Somewhere beyond the trees, thunder rumbled faintly. Not a storm this time, but a reminder that peace and power often share the same sky. A few weeks later, Robert announced a decision that surprised everyone. At a small press event for the Miller Foundation, he stood before the cameras, older, steadier, his presence commanding in its quietness. "The villa," he said, "will no longer be a private estate. It will become a home for families rebuilding after loss, a place of renewal. My wife believed every wall should shelter love, not pride. I'm honoring that." The audience applauded. But what caught most eyes wasn't the announcement. It was a man standing behind Robert, assisting with the presentation. Bradley. No title. No inherited glory. Just a man helping another man restore something sacred. When the event ended, a reporter asked Robert, "Do you believe in second chances, Mr. Miller?" Robert paused, his gaze drifting to his son before answering. "No, I believe in consequences that teach and grace that follows." That night, as twilight fell over the villa for perhaps the last time under his ownership, Robert walked through the halls alone. Each step echoed with the ghosts of laughter and arguments, of life lived in extremes. He stopped at the grand staircase and looked up, remembering the night Bradley had announced his betrayal, the way the chandelier had glimmered above his head, mocking in its brilliance. Now, the light was softer, warmer. He reached the top of the stairs and entered his wife's old room, untouched, preserved. He sat on the edge of a bed and let the quiet fill him. "I did it, Margaret," he whispered. "Not for revenge anymore, for peace." And perhaps, somewhere in the stillness, he felt her there, the approval, the forgiveness, the calm. In the final weeks before handing the villa over to the foundation, Robert packed his things himself. He didn't let the staff touch a single box. Each photograph, each letter, each tool from the days he'd built the house, all carefully stored away, not as trophies, but as memories of a life reclaimed. On his last morning there, Bradley came to help. They loaded the final box into the car together. "Where will you go?" Bradley asked. Robert looked toward the open road. "Somewhere quiet, maybe by the sea." I've spent too long fighting for walls. I think it's time I learned to live without them. Bradley smiled faintly. You'll come back. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. Only if you make this place something worth returning to. As he drove away, the villa faded in the rearview mirror, not as a monument of loss, but as a symbol of rebirth. For the first time, the road ahead felt endless, not because he was escaping, but because he was finally free. Months later, long after he'd settled into a small seaside cottage, a letter arrived. It was from Bradley. Inside were photographs, the villa transformed. Families laughing in the gardens, children playing where marble once ruled, hope blooming again where greed had died. At the bottom of the letter, a single line. You were right, Dad. Legacy isn't what we keep, it's what we give. Robert read it twice, a quiet smile forming. He set the letter down and looked out at the ocean, waves folding into one another endlessly, like the rhythm of a life finally at rest. And as the sun sank beneath the horizon, painting the sky in fire and forgiveness, he whispered the words that had lived inside him for years. Revenge built the ending. But love wrote the last line. The tide roared in agreement, and with that, the story of Robert Miller was complete. Not as a tale of vengeance, but as proof that even from betrayal, something pure can rise again.